So, welcome to the Mediacurrent Contrib Half-Hour, August 30th, having another testing lab. As usual, our agenda is some housekeeping first, then we'll look at stories so far, what we've covered so far in our lab series, and we'll have some lab time. So housekeeping, as always, my name is David McKenna. I am community lead at Mediacurrent. I've been working with Drupal since 2007, currently maintainer of some modules like meta tag, views, and a couple of others. I'm a member of the security team, and you might recognize me as a guy with the bunny ears who hop around his issue queues. My time is sponsored by Mediacurrent. We're a full-service digital agency. We build open source software. Websites using a variety of open source software. We particularly like working with Drupal, but we've gotten into a lot of interesting front-end tools in the last couple of years. So housekeeping, next week we're going to have an issues lab, then we're going to have a presentation, then general Q&A and testing lab. So into a good routine for the next couple of months. So the story so far. For Drupal 7, we have a blog post that shows how to write a very basic first test that makes sure that your site doesn't blow up when you enable a module. And there's a really great set of documentation available at api.drupal.org/Drupal web test case. It'll redirect you to the proper URL, but there's tons of API documentation in there, along with it's annotated, so people have posted comments and things explaining how to use things and whatnot. Then some of the more frequently used commands that you'll run are Drupal get to load a path. Then you assert, you get a 200 HTTP response, so you're not getting a 404 or a 500 error because something broke. Then you can do things like assert field by name to check to see if a form field exists. Then you can post values into a form, and then again, make sure that the response was correct. For Drupal 8, there's a similar blog post for writing your very first Drupal 8 functional test, along with an API documentation that is similar to the Drupal 7 API documentation, explaining the different test methods and stuff. Then on Drupal 8 land, you have very similar APIs or functions and methods and stuff for running the tests. The big difference is that instead of doing assert response, you do assert session and then status code equals, a little bit more verbose. And then for posting a form, instead of Drupal post, it's Drupal post form. Huge difference there, but it's worth being aware of, especially if you're flipping back and forth between working on the D7 and the 8 site. Some other things that we've used, the assert text method for making sure that something is in the HTML output, and assert no text to make sure that it is not available in the HTML output, in the text of the page. That does not check for HTML tags. If you need to check for exact HTML structures, you can use the assert raw, and that checks to see if the exact HTML output from the previous get or post command or AJAX request or whatever it happens to be contains the exact HTML structure that you check for. It can be a little fiddly to do because the theme has a huge effect on what the output looks like. So definitely do some checking with that, or do some fiddling with that to get it working right. As well as noting that Drupal 8 adds an awful lot of really good markup around form fields and DOM structures to make the site more accessible. So it can be a little involved, but it's worth keeping in mind. Then there's a similar function, assert no raw, to make sure that a certain HTML chunk is not on the page. For example, you never want to have a marquee statement. Then you have things like assert equals to check to see if two different variables are the same. So if you get a variable out of the site and you've got a predetermined notion of what it should be, you can set up your array, for example, or whatever object it happens to be, predefine some variables, and then do an assert equals to make sure that it is what it should be. So let's get into some lab time. And anybody in the audience happen to want to take a look at some tests that they've been working on, or need help with some tests?
I'm sorry, Damien, can you say that again?
Have you been writing any tests, or would you like some help getting off the ground writing tests for your Drupal modules or themes?
One of the things I was working on with a recent test was trying to figure out how much mocking I really needed to do versus actually write a kernel test.
That's a good question. And to be blunt, I have not gotten into writing mocks on Drupal code. It's been a while since I touched those, and it was back in Ruby on Rails days, 10 plus years ago. It's to a degree, as a more general thing, I would say if it starts becoming cumbersome keeping the mocks up to date, it might be worthwhile starting to move some of them over to kernel tests. But it can very much depend upon the module's structure. Kernel tests, I think, might be a bit more effort to set up, but might be easier to maintain.
Yeah, that's what I ended up doing. I was doing a very simple test for a service. It just had 3 methods, but they all had to talk to the database and a node entity.
Right. So, good question. Cool. So let's see. Something I thought we could look at this week is some more tests. Let me see, where is it? No. For a Drupal 8 module that I've been working on the past 2 weeks. I won't go into much detail on the module itself, but one of the things I've been trying to do is have reasonable functional test coverage. And the idea of the module is that it kind of works as a shim to shoehorn functionality into where certain functionality into an existing workflow. So in this case, creation of nodes and embedding media objects in them, either through a reference field or the WYSIWYG. So I started off with what I call basic functionality tests, and it does a whole bunch of very rudimentary steps to create a media object and then create a node, and then modifies the media object, and then reloads the node, clears the cache, reloads the node again, and basically the idea is to see what happens when the revisions change on the node and the media object, because it's trying to shoehorn revision handling into a situation that doesn't already have it. And it's a bit of a sledgehammer approach to fixing this. At least in my opinion, correct approach would have been to use paragraphs from the outset instead of doing it this way, but coming in after the fact, where it was too late to re-architect the site. Somebody else started down that road, or this road, and I kind of reworked it a bit and wrote test coverage. So at this point, the functionality works. So it creates a node, it creates media objects, it then keeps track of the revisions of each one, and pretty much works. The nice thing about having the test coverage was that in order to make further improvements to the module and to add some more functionality onto it, I had to refactor some of the core logic. But because I had test coverage, I could refactor the module, then run the tests, and make sure that it was still working. So this particular test class is pretty straightforward. It pulls in a helper trait that'll show in a moment, because one thing I do is when I've got a situation where I'm writing tests, I try to keep the test class limited to just the test methods itself. Other helper functions I like to move into a different file so that they can be reused, because in this case I was testing the basic functionality where you're just doing a normal revision workflows, and then I also need to handle forward revisions, where you create an unpublished draft version of a published node, and with CORE's functionality using content moderation. And so instead of having to go through and have the same code for creating all of the same content types and stuff, I moved those into a trait. And both the basic functionality tests and then the forward revision tests have similar setup methods that first do a a trick I've been doing for a while to skip user validation, user permissions entirely for a lot of tests and just log straight in as user 1. And then it sets up the entities, and that method just steps through creating the media entity type, then creates a content type and adds a reference field, entity reference field that points to the media object. And then for the, I also added a function or method that changes the display settings for the entity type. And that way I've got a function where I can say, okay, change it to a label display, change it to a full entity display, etc. Rather than having to step through this simple code each time. And then for the content moderation, it also has a simple method for just enabling content moderation for that entity bundle, just to keep the kind of setup logic out of the way of the actual tests. And then a simple method test to see if it works. So there's a lot of overlap between the basic functionality test and the forward revisions test. This could be refactored further. And once I finish with the next round of functionality improvements, I might look to refactor the test a bit more. But for now, this was a reasonable starting point. And there's the individual files are a little long, 200 and something lines, but they're fairly straightforward in that they just do a bunch of Drupal get commands, and then assert text, and then post to some forms. And that's all it is. So to show it again, and I do need to put some of these in a blog post. This is the method I use, or the code I use to force the user to log in as user 1 for running tests. This way it skips all user permissions, so I don't have to worry about that part. I can just worry about the basic functionality. I will typically also, if I'm writing a module or working on a module that has its own permissions, I will usually write an extra test class just for checking the permissions. But for this use case, I just log in as user 1. So it loads user 1, and then it forcibly resets the password to a basic string. And then it stores that variable, or stores the password as a variable on the user object. The reason for that is that the Drupal login method, if you pop over to api.drupal.org, and then jump to version, or the search results for Drupal 8.6, and look at the web test base class Drupal login method. If you look at the code, it uses pass_raw for checking the password, which is this one here. There's an old method, let's see, browser test base, for the older simple tests in Drupal 8, and let's see, the code, it used pass raw with a capital R. So because I tried to use the same tests as some of the same code for newer tests and older tests, having both variables there doesn't break anything, and it makes sure that this login user one method can be used on both older tests and newer tests. So that's that. Let's see. So then this is set up as a trait, which means it only works in PHP 5.4, so you can't use this with Drupal 7 sites that have to be compatible with PHP 5.3. But for Drupal 8, it's a good way of splitting off reusable code. And then it just gets loaded in using a use statement inside the class. Let me see, what else? One other handy thing is that you don't have to add all of the custom classes and things that are used in the trait don't have to be defined in the use statement or the header section of the main test class. I'm sure this is old news for most, but you can keep all of those in the separate trait file, all of these extra use statements, which keeps the main test class and test file just a little shorter and a little tidier. So all right. Hopefully we'll have more questions for next time, but as always, if you run into any questions, there is a Slack channel devoted to helping people with tests. It's the testing channel in Drupal Slack. And next week, we are going to have an issues lab. So if you're stuck on any Drupal issues or would like some help, or want to have us take a look at something, please send me a message via Twitter or my Drupal.org contact page, or pop along next time and ask in the meeting. Till then, have a great week and see you online. Thank you.